Three, two, one. We think that, first of all, there's a clear difference between a child gambling and a child watching TikTok, right? I think the main difference with their case and the other idea of what addiction is that, like, the government regulation that we have currently for stuff that are addicting are stuff that are inherently bad for your health and inherently bad for you as a whole, right? I think the problem with social media is that regardless of whether you find it addicting or not, right? I think the fact that the root problem is still there and you still have children accessing social media as a whole is the exact problem that exists with status quo. And if you would like to talk about the idea of addiction, we see that adults are also, like, addicted to social media as well. Their lives are probably more at stake of being ruined by social media because they're supposed to be independent and in charge of their own lives, who have more risk of, wasting their time on social media, right? So I don't see why we shouldn't just ban social media as a whole because it is inherently bad, right? I think, like, now this applies to the same principle of why we don't ban alcohol and why we don't inherently ban vapes, right? And I think this again applies with social media, right? Even though the fact that we see that social media does have its problems, we don't think that it's something that should be taken to something that's a governmental level, right? Because we tell you, first of all, right, we tell you that it's a parent's responsibility to basically control what their child does, right? We don't think that social media is something that necessitates the government to say that it is bad and something that they should ban inherently, right? I think a lot of people know that social media is bad, right? They know that it is kind of addicting, right? But I think something that social media companies can do is, first of all, obviously root out the problem that makes it so addicting in the first place, right? I think there's a lot of movements and a lot of design changes that actually promote for social media to be less like technicolor, right? I think there's a lot of things that actually promote social media to be more of a safe place. Why? Because they know that children are on their platform. They know that children are actively watching their content because Skibbity Toilet has become a big thing on TikTok in the recent years, right? I think secondly, right, we tell you that it doesn't necessitate a governmental ban, right? I think first of all, because it's so much more difficult to regulate, and we think that this is just an inherent parent responsibility, right? Sorry, if the parent wants to have the best interest for their child, then the best interest is to obviously regulate their child's social media use, right? We see this already happening in status quo with a lot of, like, our friends not even having social media, right? Or, like, even if they do have social media, they're not using it 24/7, right? I think this is something that talks about regulation, about how parents should have the responsibility to regulate, right? So why do we think that it doesn't necessitate a government ban? We tell you because it's so difficult to regulate, right? And I think this goes into my first argument on how we think that social media is too prevalent to be ignored. It's too prevalent for kids to not ignore in status quo, right? We tell you that the influence of social media is so big, right? And this is something that they already concede on their side of the house, right? They tell you that social media is everywhere, right? Everywhere you go, you see the Instagram logo, you see the TikTok logo, and you see these companies earning profits in the hundreds of billions, right? The fact that we live in a digitalized world and the fact that we're not living in the 1980s anymore is exactly the problem of why we think that banning social media will just not do any, like, good inherently, right? And before I continue, I'll need to get PY.
We have a contradiction. If you claim that social media, etc., is so bad on our side, then why do you not ban it? Aren't you conceding to us by the fact that if you claim that social media is really so addictive, why not just take the extra step and ban it in the first place?
Okay, we tell you that, yeah, social media is bad, right? It's horrible, right? But I think the fact that if you ban it, right, you remove the regulations that actually make it, sort of safe for children in status quo, right? I think this was already covered in first speech on how we think that a lot of things become regulated when it's legal, especially for a group that is so vulnerable to a lot of bad content, right? And I think, to continue with my argument, we think that social media is still going to be prevalent no matter what, whether you ban it or not, right? I think the fact that the barrier of access to access Instagram rather than accessing a vape is so much easier than, like, for example, obviously accessing, like, a casino or accessing a vape is exactly the reason why people see it as an easier, like, way or an easier pathway to get social media, right? We tell you that it's already easy in status quo, right? Social media companies already ask you for your age, right? But it's so easy just to lie about it, right? And even if they do ask you for a government issued ID, we see that it's also very easy to circumvent when they already concede that parents do not have the time to properly take care of their kids. Then parents have an incentive to give their kids social media because it's simply an easier way of communication for their kids, right? And, like, a lot of kids, like, just use social media as a way to, like, sort of connect with their friends inherently, right? So we tell you that they see it as a way to connect with their friends while they're still on social media, right? We tell you it's difficult to regulate because it's so widespread and, like, it's so difficult to put a barrier because there's no inherent health like there's no inherent like health deficit if you use social media. I don't think you're necessarily going to get lung cancer if you use Instagram, right? I think this differs to the fact that you will get liver cirrhosis if you use alcohol. You will get like lung cancer if you smoke, right? These are two very different things, right? Which is why kids don't see the inherent harm of using social media, because it's simply just an app, right? And we tell you that we tell you that secondly, right, the direct consequences of removing this vulnerable, like, minority of children who are on social media will inherently cause them to make social media like an even worse place than it already is, right? Because we tell you about how it's easier to circumvent, right? That kids are very tech savvy, and there's already backlash to the Australian like proposed bill to ban social media due to the fact that kids are already living in a digitalized world, and it's so easy just to use like other ways to access social media, especially when other countries didn't ban it yet, right? I think finally, right, I think the fact that you turn the internet and you turn like things that are already bad into something worse is inherently the problem, right? I think the solution on our side of the house is not to ban social media, because we don't think that the feasibility is there, right? But even if we do concede that it's bad, right, even though we do concede that a lot of things are addicting, right, we don't think that banning it inherently will make things any better for these kids, right, due to how easy it is to access, right? I think the fact that Coco Melon is so addicting to a lot of people and a lot of young kids, right, doesn't mean that we ban Coco Melon as a whole, right? We just tell parents to regulate it more and increase the awareness of these hyper addictive shows, right? I think just proves to you how ineffective it is to try and regulate every single show and every single app that exists on the app, right? I think lastly, right, I think the fact that even though you try your best to like remove the barrier of entry, even though they do get like less kids using social media on their side of the house, right, we tell you that at least if not the vast majority, still a good majority of kids will be on social media, right? And we tell you that the reality of them being on social media will be even worse on their side of the house, with social media companies now having the knowledge that like there's perhaps so-called no kids on their platform, right? Even though it's super easy to access, right? I think even without them creating a social media like profile, I think that it's so easy just to access your parents' phone. That's kind of what I did when I was 9 years old, right? I think like at the end of the day, we are the side that basically creates a better social media platform for the vast majority of the population, even when it doesn't include kids, even if we benefit those who are above the age of 16, right? So yeah, I'll miss picture. Thank you.